In the fall of 1989, in a quiet corner of rural America where nothing ever made the evening news, a woman vanished after a single night. By morning, rumors spread faster than facts. By the end of the week, an entire town was whispering a name it would later pretend to forget: Linda Carter. What happened to her was brutal, impulsive, and disturbingly ordinary, born not from organized crime or obsession, but from jealousy, pride, and a decision made in anger. This is one of those stories people claim they never heard of, until they realize it sounds uncomfortably familiar. If stories like this matter to you, forgotten cases, buried truths, and crimes that should never fade, like this video and subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next story. Linda Carter was known in Westfield, Kentucky as the Lady of the Night, though few people ever said her name out loud. She was 32 years old, originally from Ohio, and had arrived in town 2 years earlier with a single suitcase and no explanations. She worked out of a rundown roadside brothel just outside town limits, a place officially ignored by local authorities and unofficially visited by men who swore they'd never been there. Linda was quiet, observant, and careful. She listened more than she spoke. In a town built on routine, she became a secret woven into many lives. Two of those lives belonged to men who looked harmless on the surface. Mark Holloway was a truck driver who hauled livestock across county lines, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. He had been married for 11 years and had 2 children who waited for him every Sunday at the same diner booth. The other was Daniel Reeves, a carpenter who worked on barns, fences, and church repairs, known for his rough hands and soft-spoken manners. He had 1 son and a wife who had stood by him since high school. Neither man planned to fall in love. Neither intended to destroy what they already had. At first, their visits to Linda were casual, spaced out, transactional. But Linda was different. She remembered details, asked questions, and made both men feel seen in ways their daily lives no longer did. Over time, the visits became longer, the conversations deeper, the money less important than the attention. Without realizing it, Mark and Daniel were both telling her the same stories about disappointment, exhaustion, and feeling invisible at home. And Linda, perhaps lonely herself, never stopped them. The discovery came not through intuition, but through chance. Susan Holloway found a receipt tucked into Mark's jacket pocket, crumpled, unsigned, but enough to raise suspicion. Around the same time, Rebecca Reeves overheard a late-night phone call, hushed and hurried, ending with a name she didn't recognize. When both women began asking questions, the answers didn't align. What started as private doubt turned into shared certainty when they met by coincidence at the same gas station on the edge of town, each following the same unspoken fear. They compared notes, names, times, lies. And when the truth finally surfaced, it was worse than either had imagined. Their husbands weren't just unfaithful, they were in love with the same woman. And her name was Linda Carter. By dawn, the silence surrounding Linda Carter felt heavier than usual. Her car was found abandoned near a dirt road leading into a wooded area outside Westfield, the driver's door slightly open, keys still in the ignition. At first, people assumed she had simply left town, the way outsiders often did when things became complicated. But when she failed to show up for work and didn't answer calls, concern turned into unease. By the second day, the sheriff's office began asking questions no one wanted to answer. Susan Holloway and Rebecca Reeves returned to their routines with mechanical precision. Breakfasts were made, children were driven to school, laundry folded as if nothing had changed. But inside, both women were unraveling. Sleep came in fragments. Every passing siren felt personal. They avoided each other, afraid that being seen together might draw attention. What they hadn't anticipated was how quickly rumor would fill the void left by Linda's disappearance. Her name was suddenly everywhere, spoken with judgment, fascination, and fear. When Linda's remains were discovered 3 days later in a shallow ravine off County Road 12, the shock rippled through the region. The crime scene was chaotic, suggesting a struggle, but little else. The most disturbing detail, shared in hushed tones and later confirmed in sparse official statements, was that the act had been excessive, driven by rage rather than intent. Investigators would later say the violence had crossed a psychological line, transforming anger into something irreversible. For many, it was impossible to reconcile the brutality with the quiet town they believed they lived in. The investigation exposed more than the crime itself. It peeled back layers of secrecy the town had tolerated for years. Men were questioned. Names surfaced. Affairs once hidden behind polite smiles were suddenly common knowledge. Mark Holloway and Daniel Reeves both broke down during separate interrogations, each confessing to the affair but denying any involvement in Linda's death. Their grief was genuine, tangled with guilt and disbelief. They had loved her in their own flawed ways, and now she was gone. Susan and Rebecca were questioned too. At first, they presented themselves as victims, betrayed wives caught in the wreckage of someone else's choices, but inconsistencies began to appear. Witnesses remembered seeing two women arguing with Linda outside the brothel that night. Tire tracks near the scene matched Susan's borrowed sedan. A clerk recalled selling gloves late that evening to a woman who matched Rebecca's description. Slowly, the story they tried to control began slipping away. When the arrests came, the town reacted with stunned denial. These were mothers, churchgoers, women who had baked casseroles for fundraisers and waved from front porches. The idea that they were capable of such violence fractured the town's sense of moral order. Some defended them, calling it a crime of passion. Others condemned them outright. But no one could deny that what had happened was no accident. The trial the following year was brief and emotionally charged. Prosecutors painted a picture of jealousy turned lethal, of two women who fed each other's anger until it demanded blood. The defense argued temporary insanity, emotional collapse, a moment of madness fueled by betrayal. In the end, the verdict reflected both truths. Susan Holloway and Rebecca Reeves were convicted, not as masterminds, but as women who had made a catastrophic choice in a single night. Linda Carter was buried quietly, her family choosing privacy over attention. Her name faded from headlines, then from memory. But the echoes of that night never fully disappeared. In Westfield, people still lower their voices when they pass the old brothel site. Some say the town learned a lesson. Others believe it simply learned how to forget. Susan Holloway and Rebecca Reeves did not scream or confront their husbands that night. Instead, they went home and sat with the truth in silence, replaying every memory that now felt contaminated. The dinners that had gone cold, the excuses about overtime, the sudden distance in familiar hands. What hurt most was not the sex, but the realization that their husbands had shared their fears, dreams, and tenderness with another woman. And worse still, with the same woman. That detail gnawed at them. It made the betrayal feel deliberate, almost coordinated, as if their lives had been reduced to a cruel coincidence. Over the following weeks, Susan and Rebecca began talking in secret. At first, their conversations were hesitant, filled with pauses and disbelief. They met in parking lots, in the back pew of an empty church, once even sitting in a car during a rainstorm so no one would see them together. As they spoke, anger replaced shock. They compared timelines and realized how deeply involved both men were. Mark had talked about leaving. Daniel had promised a different life. And Linda, according to fragments they'd pieced together, had encouraged neither but refused to turn either away. To Susan and Rebecca, that refusal became the ultimate insult. They started watching Linda, from a distance at first. They learned her routine, the hours she worked, the nights she stayed late at the brothel when the highway traffic was heavier. They noticed how she walked alone to her car, how no one ever waited for her. In their minds, Linda stopped being a person and became a symbol, the physical proof of their humiliation. Every quiet moment fed the same thought. If Linda had never come to town, their families would still be whole. The plan didn't come together all at once. It evolved through whispered conversations and shared resentment. Susan suggested confronting her, just to scare her away. Rebecca talked about making her leave town for good. Neither woman initially spoke about violence, but both imagined it in flashes they didn't admit out loud. The more they talked, the more they convinced each other that Linda had manipulated their husbands, that she had knowingly targeted married men, that she had crossed an invisible moral line that justified retaliation. On the night of October 14, 1989, they acted. They told their families they were running errands. Susan borrowed her brother's old sedan. Rebecca brought gloves and a length of rope she claimed was only for protection. They drove to the brothel just before midnight, hearts pounding but faces set with determination. When Linda stepped outside for a cigarette, Susan called her name. Linda hesitated, confused, then approached, unaware that this was not a confrontation meant to end with words. In the months that followed the verdict, Westfield tried to return to normal. But normal no longer meant what it once had. The trial had exposed fractures that could not be sealed with silence. Families stopped making eye contact in public. Church attendance dropped, then quietly climbed again, though prayers felt heavier, more desperate. Linda Carter's name was rarely spoken, yet her absence lingered everywhere. In the diner where Mark used to sit alone now, in the hardware store where Daniel avoided the aisles he once walked proudly, and in the empty stretch of road where the brothel slowly fell into disrepair, its windows boarded up as if that could erase what had happened there. Mark Holloway lost his job within weeks. His employer cited reputation concerns, though everyone understood the unspoken reason. He moved into a small trailer on the outskirts of town, seeing his children only on weekends. Daniel Reeves stayed married longer, clinging to routine as if it were a life raft. But the damage had already been done. Trust never returned, and his home became a place of constant, suffocating quiet. Both men carried a different kind of sentence, one without a release date, defined by regret and a love they could never defend publicly. Susan and Rebecca were sent to separate correctional facilities, a decision made partly for security, partly to prevent them from reinforcing the bond that had fueled the crime. Letters they attempted to exchange were intercepted and denied. In isolation, each woman was forced to sit alone with her own version of the truth. Susan wrote often to her children, filling pages with apologies she knew could never be enough. Rebecca withdrew completely, refusing visits for over a year, her silence interpreted by some as remorse and by others as stubborn pride. Public opinion remained divided. Some saw the women as monsters who had crossed an unforgivable line. Others viewed them as symbols of emotional collapse in a society that demanded endurance without support. Talk radio shows briefly picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about jealousy and betrayal, but without sensational headlines, it soon slipped back into obscurity. No documentaries followed, no books were written. The case became one more entry in county records, filed away and rarely revisited. What made the crime unsettling was not just its brutality, but its simplicity. No elaborate cover-up, no criminal past. Just ordinary people pushed beyond restraint by humiliation and obsession. Investigators later admitted that if a few small details had gone unnoticed, a witness choosing not to speak, a receipt thrown away, the truth might never have surfaced. In that sense, the town came uncomfortably close to letting Linda Carter vanish without consequence. Years later, newcomers to Westfield would sometimes hear fragments of the story, usually distorted, often incomplete. A woman killed over a man. A jealous rage. A bad night. But the full weight of what happened, the shared guilt, the moral collapse, the lives permanently altered, rarely survived retelling. Linda became a cautionary whisper rather than a person, her humanity stripped away just as thoroughly in death as it had been in life. And that may be the most disturbing part of all. Not that the crime happened, but that it was so easy for everyone to move on. As the years passed, the case of Linda Carter settled into an uncomfortable limbo between memory and denial. Official records remained intact, but the emotional residue lingered in quieter ways. Children who had been too young to understand grew up hearing fragments of the story from older relatives, always lowered voices, always unfinished sentences. Teachers avoided the subject. Local newspapers never revisited it. Westfield learned to survive by omission. Susan Holloway's children struggled the most. At school, their last name became a burden they did not choose. Friends' parents suddenly hesitated to invite them over. Susan's letters grew less frequent as guilt and shame consumed her. She spoke often of regret, but never of justification. In her words, the anger that once felt righteous now appeared senseless, a fire that had burned everything, including herself. She served her sentence quietly, refusing interviews, declining every opportunity to explain herself publicly. Rebecca Reeves changed in a different way. Where Susan bent inward, Rebecca hardened. Fellow inmates described her as distant, controlled, almost cold. She never spoke Linda's name. When asked about the crime during mandatory counseling sessions, she framed it as an accident of emotion, a moment where reality collapsed under pressure. Yet those who listened closely noticed the cracks. Brief pauses, clenched hands, the subtle signs of a woman replaying the same night endlessly, unable to rewrite its ending. Mark Holloway attempted to leave Westfield twice. Both times he returned within months. The town was small, but it was the only place that still knew who he had been before everything unraveled. He drank heavily for a period, then stopped abruptly after a health scare. Those who spoke with him later said he never forgave himself, not for the affair, but for allowing two women to destroy themselves over him while he walked away alive. Daniel Reeves withdrew almost entirely from public life. He worked alone, spoke little, and avoided relationships altogether. Linda's memory followed him like a shadow he could not escape. What made the story resurface briefly was a rumor in the late 1990s that the brothel land would be sold and redeveloped. For a moment, old wounds reopened. Letters to the editor argued whether the site should be preserved, erased, or left untouched. In the end, nothing happened. The building collapsed during a storm, its remains cleared without ceremony. No marker was placed, no acknowledgement made. Linda Carter's grave, several counties away, remained unvisited except by distant relatives. There were no flowers left by strangers, no anniversaries observed. She became a statistic, a woman killed in a crime of passion, her complexity flattened by time. Few remembered that she had laughed easily, that she had once talked about leaving town, that she had believed, perhaps foolishly, that affection could exist without consequence. The case was never officially reopened, never reconsidered. It didn't fit the narratives people preferred to tell about themselves. And so it stayed buried, not because it lacked impact, but because remembering it demanded too much honesty. By the early 2000s, Westfield had changed on the surface, but not in spirit. New businesses opened, old families moved away, and the next generation grew up believing the town's worst days were behind it. Yet those who had lived through 1989 knew better. The crime had altered something fundamental, a quiet understanding that violence did not always come from outsiders or strangers, but could grow slowly inside ordinary homes, fed by resentment and silence. In the end, what remained of the case was not outrage, but discomfort, the kind that sits quietly in the background, rarely acknowledged, yet never fully gone. For those who lived in Westfield in 1989, Linda Carter's story became a reference point, a moment when the town realized how thin the line was between normal life and irreversible violence. It wasn't spoken of at gatherings or taught as a lesson, but it shaped behavior in subtle ways. People watched their words more carefully. Secrets felt heavier. Jealousy, once dismissed as harmless, carried a sharper edge. Years later, a retired deputy who had worked the case admitted that what unsettled him most was how ordinary everything had been. No criminal mastermind, no long history of abuse, just people who reached a breaking point and refused to step back. He said the evidence never showed a clear moment where things had to turn deadly, only a series of small choices that built momentum until stopping felt impossible. In his words, "It was a crime that didn't need to happen, but once it started, nobody knew how to end it." Linda's family tried briefly to keep her memory alive. Her sister wrote letters to newspapers asking that Linda be remembered as more than a headline, more than a label. The letters were never published. Editors chose silence over complexity. Eventually, the family stopped trying. Grief, like everything else in this case, was pushed into the private corners of life where it could be managed, but never resolved. What often goes unspoken is how fear shaped the aftermath. Fear of judgment, fear of self-reflection, fear of admitting that love, when mixed with resentment and pride, can become dangerous. Westfield didn't just forget Linda Carter. It buried the questions her death raised. Questions about responsibility, about emotional neglect, about how easily empathy disappears when blame feels more convenient. For outsiders, the story sounds extreme. For those who lived it, it felt uncomfortably close to reality. Many later admitted they had known pieces of the truth long before the crime occurred. They had seen the signs, the late nights, the tension, the quiet desperation. But like so many communities, they believed it wasn't their place to intervene. Silence, once again, played its role. And so the case faded, not because it lacked significance, but because remembering it required acknowledging that the capacity for cruelty did not belong to strangers. It lived among them, hidden in plain sight. Susan Holloway was granted parole after serving more than a decade. Her release was not announced publicly, but word spread quickly anyway. Some residents were uneasy knowing she was free, while others believed she had paid enough. Susan never returned to Westfield. She moved several states away, changed her last name, and took a job cleaning motel rooms. In rare letters to her children, she wrote about accountability, about how one moment of rage could define an entire lifetime. She avoided interviews and refused every request to tell her story for money or attention. Rebecca Reeves served a longer sentence. Her behavior behind bars was considered exemplary, but parole boards noted her emotional detachment as a concern. When she was eventually released, she returned briefly to Kentucky, then disappeared from public records altogether. Some said she remarried. Others believed she lived under an assumed identity. No one ever confirmed either version. What remained clear was that she never sought forgiveness, nor did she publicly deny her role. Her silence became her final statement. Mark and Daniel never spoke to each other again. The bond they had shared through Linda dissolved into mutual blame and shame. Each believed the other had been more deeply involved, more reckless, more responsible. Neither attended Linda's funeral. Both later admitted that absence haunted them more than anything else. In private moments, they questioned whether a different choice, a confession, a goodbye, an end to the affair, might have saved everyone involved. Occasionally, a true crime blogger or regional journalist would stumble across the case while researching old records. A few drafts were written. None were published. Editors deemed the story too disturbing without being sensational enough, too morally complex for easy consumption. It lacked a clear villain people could comfortably hate. Instead, it forced readers to confront uncomfortable questions about accountability, gender, desire, and the thin line between victim and perpetrator. What makes the case of Lynda Carter linger is not just how she died, but how quickly she was reduced to a role rather than remembered as a person. She was labeled a prostitute, a temptation, a catalyst, anything that allowed others to distance themselves from her humanity. In doing so, the town found a way to justify forgetting her. And forgetting in Westfield became a form of survival. Yet memory has a way of resurfacing. In quiet conversations, in late-night confessions, in the unease that still settles over certain roads after dark. Lynda Carter may have lost her life in 1989, but the consequences of that night never truly ended. Today, Lynda Carter's name exists mostly in court transcripts, yellowing newspaper clippings, and the memories of a shrinking number of people who were there when it happened. To everyone else, her story is just another forgotten crime from a small town that preferred to move on rather than look inward. There is no plaque, no memorial, no official acknowledgement of what was lost that night in 1989. Only absence. What makes this case so unsettling is not the violence alone, but how banal it was. No grand motive, no promise of gain. Just wounded pride, jealousy, and the terrifying speed at which anger can turn into action. 2 marriages were destroyed long before a life was taken. Children grew up without parents they once trusted, and a woman who existed on the margins was erased almost entirely, as if her life had been expendable from the start. Lynda Carter was not a symbol, though she was treated like one. She was not a lesson, though people turned her into one. She was a person who believed she could matter to someone, even temporarily, in a world that had offered her few choices. That belief cost her everything. And the town that watched it unfold learned quietly that morality is often judged not by actions, but by who commits them. Cases like this don't disappear because they are solved. They disappear because remembering them is uncomfortable. They force us to confront how ordinary people can commit extraordinary harm, how silence enables destruction, and how easily empathy is withdrawn when blame feels easier. Lynda Carter did not lose her life because she was reckless. She lost it because too many people reduced her to a role instead of recognizing her humanity. If this story disturbed you, that reaction is the point. Forgotten crimes deserve to be remembered, not for shock, but for truth. If you've made it this far, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you think about this case. Share this video so this story doesn't disappear again, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss the next forgotten story.